It really is very important that this organization exists. It's important because I think there was a trend in this country on Middle East studies that I wouldn't call terribly realistic. It wasn't that the scholars weren't scholarly, but there was a certain set of biases that needed to be counterbalanced to have good scholarship, to provide a good backdrop to discussions on U.S. foreign and national security policy. And I think this organization does that. So my hat is off to Mark Clark, David Silverstone, and the board of this institution. I hate to talk about this subject. It's really trying to talk about a strategy for the Middle East. And the reason I hate to talk about it is because it's so difficult. Every time I think about it, I think about the closing line of Woody Allen's movie, Annie Hall. And it goes something like this. Woody Allen is musing, as he often does, and he's thinking about talking to his psychiatrist, and he says, you know, I have a real problem with my brother. He thinks he's a chicken. And the psychiatrist says to him, well, if he thinks he's a chicken, that's a serious matter. You ought to have him institutionalized. He thinks he's a chicken. And Woody Allen says, well, we would, but we can't. We can't because we need the eggs. And that's the Middle East. We need the eggs. So we have to pretend that it's a real chicken. It's filled with so many problems that the only way to come at them is the way our government has not, namely with a strategy. Strategy gives you power. Strategy tells you what to get into and what to stay out of. It tells you how to invest your power. It makes judgments about what is achievable and what buttons can be pushed successfully and which can't. And it's just striking to me how we've approached the Middle East, country by country, and more so, crisis by crisis. And we've not come up with a strategy. And the result, look at the title of my talk that David and I agreed upon, is one failure after another. What can we do about it? How can we go through 50 years with so little to show for it? How can we fail so much and survive? And the answer is, the survival answer is the easiest part of it. We are the United States of America. We're an incredibly powerful country, and we can take setbacks. But it's also true that our power is in decline, and that it's going to become more and more difficult for us to absorb those setbacks in the future. All the more need for a strategy. Just look at some of the mistakes we've made that really could have felled any nation but the United States. Most recently, we pushed the Israelis and the Palestinians to restart their negotiations without any clear sense beforehand, other than they're telling us they're serious about negotiations. We pushed them to formal negotiations under the Klieg lights of the world. And what happens? They fail. You can't push them to negotiations unless you have a very good reason to believe that the hurdles you know will arise can be surmounted. Otherwise, you fail. And when you fail, you further radicalize the politics of the region. What do you do about it that we didn't even think to do? Everyone was clamoring for us to push them back to the table, as we have time after time, only to fail. There were alternatives. And in this case, I think the hope lies in thinking about Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, much like the negotiations in Northern Ireland. For 10 years or more, the British pushed the Catholics and the Protestants to the table, and they failed. And they pushed them to the table again, and they failed. And finally, the light went off in their heads that they were failing because there was no political support for compromise and for peace. So they stepped back from pushing the parties to do things they could not do, and they began to develop and support women's groups of Catholics and Protestants, business groups of Catholics and Protestants, and the effect was they created constituencies to support compromise and peace, and they made deals. We need to bring that kind of effort to the Israeli-Palestinian situation. That has a better chance of succeeding. And there's a basis for it now that didn't exist previously. One is General Keith Dayton did a fantastic job, along with the Jordanians, of training Palestinian security forces, such that there is more security in key areas of the West Bank. And the Israelis see that, and they see for the first time that if a deal were to be made in the future, that the Palestinians might actually be able to keep it. They could maintain security. And also, the conditions are better because the Palestinians have a prime minister who has really been quite successful at developing the economy on the West Bank. This guy is a pragmatist, a hard-headed guy who wants his people to lead better lives. And those better lives will give them more of a stake in serious negotiations. So the kind of approach I'm talking about has a chance to work. Otherwise, we fail. Look what happened in Iraq. We got involved in a war there, a major war there, because the President of the United States and his principal aides told us that they were on the verge, Iraq was on the verge of having weapons of mass destruction. Well, the opposite turned out to be true. He was getting rid of those weapons, but he was afraid to communicate that because if he did, he thought he'd be overthrown or overrun by Iran. But we went into a war there because of that. Then, since we didn't find the weapons, we say we're doing it for democracy, to promote democracy there. Now, I hope that after all the sacrifice we have made in that country, and the Iraqis too, that they can have some semblance of a democracy. But we don't stay there for that reason. We stay there for the reason we shouldn't have gone in there in the first place. Iraq was the strategic counterbalance to Iran. All the hard-headed neocons who wanted to go get rid of Saddam forgot the basic principle of neoconism, which is balance of power. And when you got rid of Saddam and crushed Iraq, you made Iran into the dominant regional power. It was a fundamental strategic error. And look at Afghanistan. We had every good reason, and I fully supported it, of going in there and clobbering the Taliban after 9/11. But what about the strategic rationale for staying there and fighting a major land war? Let me come back to that. These are a lot of expensive, in my mind, failures. And the only way we can overcome them and the challenges that will arise is with a strategy. What do you do when you start thinking in strategic terms? The first thing you do is to ask yourself, what really counts for us in that area? If you don't go through that discipline, anything that happens is something you've got to fix. But what really matters to us? First, Israel. Second, oil and gas. Oil and gas. Third, terrorists. Fourth, nukes, particularly as they relate to terrorists. The things that don't matter, as far as I'm concerned, that should not engage us in any major cost operations or major extensions of U.S. power, are threefold. One, we're not in the Middle East to promote democracy, Jeffersonian or otherwise. Let them evolve as they will. When we push them to do democracy, you get Gaza. The bad guys get elected. Let's let our friends there decide when they want to hold elections that are freer. Let's not take self-defeating action that not only makes us look hypocritical about our principles, but ends up damaging our national interests. It's not democracy. Second, it's not the grand old strategic global power game. Yes, we have differences with Russia and China about the Middle East, but these are not differences, as in days of yore, that in any way involve conflicts of vital interest among great powers. In fact, we cooperate to a considerable degree with both Russia and China on Middle Eastern issues, because they're worried about terrorism, they're worried about nukes, they want to maintain the supply of oil. So, that we're doing this as part of some grand strategic global game, that's a phantasm. The other reason is that we have an interest in supporting Israel no matter what it does. Now, I think Israel, as I said, is the starting point of how I think about the region strategically. And I believe we ought to make sure in every way we can that Israel remains the dominant military power in the region, and that they feel, insofar as they can, they feel secure. But that does not mean that there is agreement on every issue between them and us. There isn't. And we ought not to get into the strategic frame of mind that whatever they feel they have to do, we have to support them. And I'm thinking here particularly of Iran. This is an area where we really have to have the most serious kinds of exchange with the Israelis so that they and we don't put ourselves in an impossible situation. On almost everything, we can back the Israelis. But almost everything is not everything. And they shouldn't think that it's everything, and we shouldn't think that it's everything. Now, let me go back to the things that count. First, Israel. As I said, we have to do everything we can to make them feel militarily secure. And I think we, by and large, do that. We have to be much more sensitive in working with them on the negotiations because we don't want to push them to failure. Secondly, the terrorist problem is a horrendous problem. But it's mainly a problem that occurs within states in the region. In fact, one of the hallmarks of the 21st century is that the real problems now take place not between nations, as they did throughout history, but within nations. And it's much more it's much more difficult to apply power within a state than in contacts between states. It's much more complicated, and it's less effective. So getting at the terrorist problem in these other countries, I think, is much more an issue for us of externalities. We have to do better intelligence, we have to do better police work, and we have to continue to develop what I would call deterrent strike and commando strike capabilities when we need to. For example, in Yemen, when we spied some al-Qaeda people driving along the road, we called in a predator and we hit them and we got them. That's good. But to think that we're going to deal with terrorists in the region through major land wars strikes me as a fundamental strategic error. What do you do about the nukes? The nukes are a very complicated issue because when you look at the way our governments have handled nuclear weapons developments in states throughout the world, it doesn't make much sense. It's hard to figure out which end is up. You know, to me, the most dangerous nuclear weapons state in the world, by far, is Pakistan. If I'm worried about a country misusing nuclear weapons, I think first of Pakistan. If I think of a country that has already done us more damage with its nuclear program than any other country, I think of Pakistan. Their nuclear scientist, A.Q. Khan, was responsible for giving nuclear technology and material to Libya, to North Korea, and to others. This is a very serious business. Nobody else has done us such harm. And yet, you know, we're now supplying Pakistan with billions of dollars in military and economic aid because of the war in Afghanistan, and the nuclear issue is kind of put aside. In the case of India, we didn't do anything about their development of nuclear weapons. They're a democracy. But fine. Then we went ahead and made an agreement with the Indians to sell them nuclear power plants and to accept that all their nuclear power plants run by the Indian military would not be subject to IAEA inspections. We exempted them from the main provision of that treaty, inspections. Now, it's lovely they're Democrats. I love the Indians because they're a democracy. But inspections is the hardcore basis of an anti-nuclear regime. And they were exempted. We exempted Israel for good reason. We felt that they needed an ultimate deterrent, that they had to be able to say or have other nations know the risks that would be run in trying to do great bodily harm to Israel. So we made an exception there. With the North Koreans, we said if you destroyed your plutonium and uranium enrichment capabilities, we'll sell you light water nuclear plants, which are also capable of producing nuclear material. We've got a anti-nuclear regime that doesn't make much sense. And it's hard to put all those genies back in any one bottle. Which means that our focus has to be on nukes and the terrorists. That's what we have to watch out for. Now, how would I put some of these pieces together? In the first place, I think we've got to begin to think about the Middle East differently than we have throughout our historical experience. It's not really just the Middle East. It's not the Arab states and Israel. It's not just the Arab states and Northern Africa. It's now the Middle East, for all intents and purposes, strategically, now moves toward the Gulf, includes the Arabian Peninsula states, the Gulf states, and Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. They're strategically interconnected. This is an Islamic and an Arab world. What we do in one place matters in the others. And the single worst thing to do in this situation is to fail. Failure is the biggest body blow to power and to credibility, to fail. So we've got to think about how to reorder our presence in the area, our interest in the area, and the use of our power in the area. I already made the case about what I would do in the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. Not fail, try to figure out a new way to negotiate that can succeed. Secondly, I would think about two states as being very important to our long-term concerns in this part of the world: Turkey and Egypt. As long as Egypt is stable, there's going to be no explosion of a conventional war in the region. If you have peace between Egypt and Israel, you're going to have peace in that section of the Middle East. Very important to keep it.
When the Muslim brothers come to power, they will not keep it.
Oh, I don't want them to come to power. The question was if the Muslim brothers come to power, they wouldn't keep it. That's why I would leave it up to Mubarak and company to decide how to handle their democratic elections. Because I think if they held the kind of elections that some of our friends were urging on them in the past administration, they would have ended up like Gaza. And we don't want that. Egypt is very important to us. Turkey is, and we don't pay attention to those countries strategically and in terms of long-run relationships. What do you do about Iraq? Well, we already made the mistake of effectively destroying that state as a counterweight to Iran. And so, as we draw down the 50,000 U.S. troops that remain there, I think we have to try to come to an agreement with the Iraqi government to keep 10 to 15,000 U.S. troops in that country indefinitely. It's needed as that counterweight to Iran. Right now, we're obligated to get them all out. And I trust that we will soon begin negotiations to provide for this residual force. What do you do about Iran? I listened to a very interesting panel before, a very disciplined presentation about how to prepare for a military campaign. But the more the presenters themselves got into it, the more it was clear that the military operation depended upon a whole number of political assumptions, including things like, will Turkey support a U.S. military attack on Iran? Will NATO? Will the people of Iran side with us against their rulers, or will our attack against them unify the Iranian people? All very, very serious questions. Now, I personally think that the questions are so profound that we should not launch a military attack. But I think at the same time, I would never take that card off the table and never lead the Iranians to believe that it's off the table. We can tell them we don't want to do it. But should they continue moving in that direction, what I would say to them is this: you are putting your country at great risk. Because if you actually deploy a nuclear capability, here's the situation you put us in, and you put the Israelis in, for that matter. You put us in the situation where if there's any movement of that nuclear capability toward attack, we've got to act right away. And we'll come after you right away, no ifs, ands, buts, maybes. I think we have to put that thought in their minds. But to tell them that they can't have a uranium enrichment capability subject to appropriate IAEA inspections is totally inconsistent with what's left of our anti-nuclear policy. They are a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty that gives them the right to have a uranium enrichment capability subject to inspections. We've exempted, as I said, India from them. We certainly exempted the PACs. We exempted Israel. The Iranians would never buy a demand that they've got to give it all up. So the question is working out how to let them keep it under suitable controls, because there's not going to be any agreement with them short of it. And you should remember that it's not just these Iranian bad guys who want this capability. It's not just Ahmadinejad. It's the people who ran against him. Talk to them. They want this. They feel Iran has the right to have a uranium enrichment capability as well. Not nuclear weapons, but that capability under the NPT. And they support the government on this question. Don't have any illusions about that. Afghanistan, Pakistan. Look, every time we get into a war without thinking through what we're going to do, we end up putting ourselves in a strategic position where we can't just walk away from it because we've committed the power and credibility of the United States. And here we've done that, so we can't just walk away from it. But we have to ask ourselves two key strategic questions. One, even if we win in Afghanistan, if we, in effect, defeat the Taliban, what does that do to the terrorist threat to the United States, our friends and allies? It's now morphed. It's not what it was 10 years ago. It's now all over the world, London, Newark, Yemen, you name it. And we have to prepare for it and think about it that way. So what exactly do we gain by, quote, defeating the Taliban? Secondly, what exactly is the relationship between a good outcome in Afghanistan and the larger concern about the PACs, a totally unstable Muslim country of 180 million people with nuclear weapons who is telling us to stay and fight in Afghanistan forever while they're helping our enemy kill us, providing them with arms and sanctuary. Just think about that. Whenever you're faced with such practical anomalies, you have to rethink your strategy. We can't just walk out of the place, but the United States is not limited to one way of using its power, staying there and fighting open-ended land wars. We can come down to a small and sustainable force to provide training, logistics, intelligence, and the like. We can continue to provide the Afghans with military and economic aid. We can provide them with external support as well. We can put together a containment alliance of their neighbors who all oppose the Taliban and religious extremism and the drug trade. And we have considerable offshore deterrent capability. That's another way of using American power to contain whatever threat remains in Afghanistan. And as far as Pakistan is concerned, we face an even more difficult task because we have to try to find groups within Pakistan that are capable of governing and making the hard decisions to see that that country does not fall apart. I'm glad that I've made you so happy. But really what I'm inviting you to do, particularly this group, because this group contains hardheads, it contains hardheads, is to tackle this question of U.S. strategy to that region. Because otherwise, we will find ourselves embroiled in one mistake after another. Thank you very much.